Hello and welcome to the next chapter of the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. Still in the early weeks of 1890, Lasker received an invitation from the Liverpool Chess Club to cross the pond over to England and play as their distinguished guest. Now, Liverpool, you may remember, was the hometown of the Amsterdam tournament winner Amos Byrne, and a match between him and Lasker is quite a mouth-watering prospect indeed. So it's no surprise that Lasker accepted the invitation and traveled to Liverpool. I'll take this time to mention that the new icon that I'm using for Lasker comes from the British periodical The Chess Monthly, who wrote a short excerpt on Lasker following his exploits here in England. I'll be using this image of him for his time in the country. Anyway, Lasker got to England and settled in Liverpool in February, but unfortunately for him and for chess fans alike, Amos Byrne was not available for a match. He was known to take very long breaks from competitive chess, and in fact, following the Amsterdam tournament, his next important chess event wouldn't be until the celebrated Hastings tournament of 1895, which is quite a little bit away from now. So the Liverpool club had to put together some sort of plan in order to make Lasker's trip worth his while, and thankfully they were rewarded because another master was in the vicinity and one who was very eager to play chess against anybody at any time. I am, of course, talking about the gentleman sitting across from Lasker at the table this time around, Mr. Henry Bird. Now, Henry Bird is, without exception, the most experienced chess player on the entire planet. And I can say this because not only is he the only remaining active player, but is also one of only 2 or 3 surviving players that competed at the Great London 1851 tournament, the first such international tournament. Bird lost in the first round. It was a knockout format, but he was playing against an experienced master and was only about 21 at the time, so this is far from a bad result. After this tournament, Bird's career took quite a while to develop because he wasn't a chess player by profession. He was an accountant, and it was this job that actually cut into his chess on more than one occasion. For example, at the Birmingham tournament in 1858, he had to withdraw from the first round due to professional obligations. Later, in 1866, he had to withdraw from a match against the current world champion Wilhelm Steinitz at around the halfway point, Steinitz leading by a game or two. Despite this match being terminated early, it was arguably what put Bird on the map. Steinitz was considered already by some to be the strongest player in the world, and so anybody who's able to stand toe-to-toe with him over this many games is certainly a strong enough player. And so from here on out, Bird started getting invites to all of the major international competitions. Now, to give you an idea of how experienced a player Bird is, I'm going to list off ideally all of the important international tournaments he's played. I may have missed some, but regardless, this list is quite expansive. So here we go. Vienna 1873, Philadelphia 1876, Paris 1878, Wiesbaden 1880, Vienna 1882, London 1883, Nuremberg 1883, London 1885, Hamburg 1885, Hereford 1885, London 1886, Nottingham 1886, London 1887, Bradford 1888, New York, 1889, and finally the first tournament on this list that Bird actually won, the recently concluded London 1889 tournament. So Bird clearly wins in the experience game, but as the results show, he didn't win all that many events. There are many reasons for this, and quite a few of them can be chalked up to his style. Bird was considered one of the more eccentric players of his day, especially in the opening. There are a lot of offbeat openings that bear his name. For example, in the Spanish, let's say, after bishop to b5, knight to d4 is known as Bird's defense. Also, in the Italian game, after bishop c4, c3, knight f6, d3 or d4 go into the main lines, but you can also go into Bird's attack by playing instead b4. This also doesn't see very much play. Finally, there is the most well-known of all of Bird's openings, Bird's opening, f4. This is the move that we'll be taking a look at in this game. Some quick logistics before we jump into the match. 7 wins was required, as is shown beneath the camera. The time control was 20 moves per hour, and the stake was, I believe, 150 German marks, or about 7.5 British pounds, give or take. This intro has been sufficiently long, so I think it's about time we get into the chess. As mentioned, Mr. Bird has the first move in the first game, and he opens with his move, f4. Now, in the very first game of this entire series, we saw Lasker respond to this move with e5, but here he responds in the more classical way by playing d5. And after e3, he opts for one of the more topical moves at the time, g6. In his notes for the game Amos Byrne, he did write for a periodical, mentions that both Blackburn and Gunsberg like this defense. Now, I have found games from Mr. Isidore Gunsberg that include g6, though none from this particular move order. After knight to f3 and bishop to g7, the most popular move in this position is bishop to e2. Now, in 1885, Mr. Blackburn played knight to h6 against another English player, Mr. Edmund Thorold. Play continued with both players castling, Thorold striking in the center with d4, and after b6, b3, c5, c3, bishop to b7, the great Blackburn would, as per usual, go on to win this game. Now, Bird, as is so often the case, did not play the most popular move, bishop to e2. He instead opted for the move c3. Now, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but Bird here is invoking theory from the London 1851 tournament. You see, in one of the games played, e6 happened. This was played in one of the round 2 matchups between Hugh Alexander Kennedy and Marmaduke Wyville. Play continued very strangely, bishop to d3, knight to h6, bishop to c2, castles, and after c5, d3 was played by Mr. Kennedy. Despite his awkward position, he would go on to win this game as white. Lasker continues very sensibly with knight to f6, and after knight to a3 and castles, knight to c2 was played in a 2007 game between Zlatko Katulic and Leo Pechnik, ultimately resulting in a draw. But here, Bird decides to play the move bishop to e2. And on this move, it's a novelty, so it's as of move 6 that the players are playing a unique game. Lasker takes a second to put his pawn on a6, and after Bird castles, knight to c6, this knight finally drops back to c2, and here Lasker plays rook to e8. One huge problem with Bird's current development scheme is that his bishop here on c1 has absolutely no way to get into the game. Lasker wants to take advantage of this by trying to force matters in the center with things like e5, while Bird remains underdeveloped. Bird tries to meet this by playing in the center himself with knight to e5. Lasker takes, knight captures e5, f captures e5, and then he drops his knight back to d7. To me, knight to e4 looks at least as good. The point here is that white doesn't want to defend this pawn with d4, because then the e4 square is a permanent outpost for the knight. And if you play d3, then this knight is free to drop back to c5, and the d3 pawn itself becomes weak. You can certainly imagine in the near future black getting a chance to play bishop to f5 and attack this pawn, and white's position looks very uncomfortable. However, Lasker did not retreat his knight without a plan. His justification is that after knight to d7, d4 is allowed, but he's allowed to play f6 himself. And it was believed that this move forced an exchange of pawns, which only favors Lasker. Now, there's this really cool sequence that the commentators of the day all missed that starts with this move e4. If you don't take this pawn on e4, then white is able to trade off their weak pawn and is basically fine. So strategically, taking on e4 seems like the best play, but now this opens up bishop to c4 with check. After the king moves, let's say to h8, bishop to f7, and after rook to f8, e6. And it's quite likely that black will have to sacrifice the exchange here on f7 to alleviate this sudden pressure. Now, black isn't worse or anything. They're going to have the bishop and probably 2 pawns once this pawn is won for the rook, so material will be equal. But this is quite a dynamic fight and definitely something that I believe Bird would enjoy. But Bird did not find the sequence starting with e4. He instead played knight to b4, trying to attack Lasker's pawn on d5, and after it was defended with knight to b6, he consented to the trade. E captures f6, e captures f6. So now Bird is saddled with this weak e-pawn that he has to defend, and he doesn't really have any activity to compensate because his bishop is still stuck here on the back rank. White is definitely worse, and there's no way around it. But Bird has earned a reputation as a fighter, so he keeps going. He starts by playing the move b3, and Lasker plays bishop to e6. The point being that after Bird moves, knight to d3, he's able to slot this bishop back on f7. Now this bishop is perfectly equipped for guard duty, it can defend the d5 pawn, and this knight is free to maneuver elsewhere. Bird plays queen to e1, getting ready to reinforce his e-pawn, and Lasker remaneuvers his knight, starting with knight to d7, queen to f2, and queen to e7, so now starting to apply lots of pressure to the e-pawn. Bird relocates his bishop over to f3. Now in this position, very direct plans for Lasker exist. For example, he could play this move bishop to h6, attacking the e-pawn for a 3rd time, and after Bird defends it with rook to e1, he can play f5, taking complete control of the e4 square and keeping this pawn weak basically forever. This is quite direct, but here Lasker is intent on securing his queenside against future attacks, so he starts with this move rook a to c8. After a4 from Bird, he bolsters the d5 pawn with c6, bishop to d2, and only now f5. So the time control has been reached, as this is Lasker's 20th move, and the dynamic remains very well established, with Lasker having this annoying pressure on the e-file, and Bird having very little activity in response. Now, this is exactly the kind of position that Bird is known for playing, and he begins fighting back with his trademark style, starting with the thrust g4. Lasker puts his bishop back on e6, and now it's imperative that Bird plays this move h3. The point here is that black doesn't really want to trade on g4. This position favors white because the defender of the e4 square has been taken away. White is closer to pushing e4, and if they do, things will go crazy. So you can play a move like knight to f6 here as black, adding more attackers to the g4 pawn. White can simply defend it with queen to g2. Eventually you're going to have to play some sort of neutral move, at which point white is able to play knight to c5. If they're able to win the bishop pair, then they can start opening things up with pushing the c3 pawn to c4, and suddenly this will be the kind of crazy position that Bird thrives in. Bird did not play h3. He instead played queen to g2 right away, and this unfortunately falls to a series of trades. F captures g4, bishop captures g4, bishop captures g4, queen captures g4, and now knight to f6 comes with tempo. Bird has to drop his queen back, he puts it on g2, and now Lasker is able to slot his knight here on e4. So not only has Lasker stopped any hope of Bird getting some sort of kingside attack, he's also firmly established his knight on this very strong e4 outpost. He's much better now. But the game must go on, and Bird keeps playing. Rook to f3. Here Lasker now starts attacking the e-pawn with bishop to h6. Bird cuts off the e-file with knight to e5, and Lasker retreats his bishop back to g7. The players repeat, knight to d3, bishop to h6, knight to e5, bishop back to g7, and here Bird plays knight back to d3. Now, under our modern rules, Bird could have claimed the draw by threefold repetition with this move. The rules on threefold repetition at this point in time weren't exactly formalized, and it was generally left up to the players to agree to the draw at this point. Lasker, of course, did not agree to the draw, and it was only here that he deviated by playing the move rook to c7. Now here, right after quote-unquote missing the draw, Bird plays the move c4, which I mentioned earlier gives him a chance to fight, but in this particular position, it's unfortunately just a mistake. The commentators gave either rook a to e1 or rook a to f1 as improvement moves, and it makes sense given that Bird's mistake ultimately ends up being the bishop on this diagonal, though this particular position I'm not super sure about for white either. None of the notes of the contemporaries gave a response after queen to a3. The b-pawn is simply going to fall. So I'm not super sure how they would want to handle this position, but I do at least agree that it is better than what Bird played in c4. Now it's been a little bit since we've done one of these, so what I want you to do, pause the video, see if you can find the sequence of moves that Lasker has here that enables him to get a decisive advantage. Alright, 3, 2, 1. I admit the move order here is a little bit interchangeable, so as long as you found the following moves in some order, I'll give you credit for this. Lasker started by taking on c4, and after b captures on c4, he attacked the long diagonal with c5. Of course, you can't take the pawn because the rook is sitting behind it. So here, Bird tried knight to f4. Now, interestingly, after c captures d4, the threat is, of course, knight to d5, coming with a fork and winning the exchange. Interestingly, I still think black is actually perfectly fine here. You move the queen somewhere, doesn't matter, knight c7, queen c7, and after rook a to f1, you can play this move bishop to h6. The queen will capture on c4 on the next move, maintaining material parity, and black's exchange sacrifice looks quite reasonable. Yes, white is very strong on the open f-file, but you still have all of these weak pawns here, and I do think that black has very reasonable chances to win this endgame. But no matter how fine black may be in that endgame, there's no reason to play c captures on d4 and go into it. Lasker played the best move and the third move that you need to find in this sequence, knight captures on d2. Any of these moves can be played in any order, and the evaluation is still more or less the same. Bird recaptured the knight on d2, and now Lasker played this move queen to e4. Very important. Dodging the fork from knight to d5, forcing Bird to spend a move dealing with the fact that his rook is attacked, and now the queen is able to join the central struggle against these pawns. Bird defended his rook with rook a to f1, and only now does Lasker take c captures on d4. Now, the point here that Bird unfortunately faces is that recapturing doesn't do anything. If you take here on d4, then queen captures on d4, forks the king and the queen, so queen captures d4 is played, and after bishop captures d4, this also comes with check, The king moves somewhere, rook captures c4, black is just up 2 pawns. Game over. So Bird tries to keep some pieces on the board and set up tricks. He plays knight to d5, and after rook captures on c4, queen to g2. One last cute little try. If queen captures on d5, taking advantage of the undefended knight, then the rook gives a check on f8, opens up this attack on the queen, and suddenly it's white who wins. Of course, Lasker isn't going to fall for such cheapos, even in close to time trouble as this is his 37th move. He played the correct move, d captures on e3, and after knight captures e3, rook captures a4 is completely winning. The move he settled on, rook to c3, is also completely winning. Basically everything is completely winning, and Bird is pretty much done for. He's down 2 pawns, he doesn't resign for a little bit, so I'll play the rest of the game out, as it's not particularly interesting. So there you go, that is the first game in the match between the established master Henry Bird and the up-and-coming master Emanuel Lasker. A pretty competitive game for the most part. This is very reminiscent of a lot of Bird games where he plays a relatively poor opening, and although it takes a little bit, he does eventually sometimes come back into the fight. Unfortunately for him, this time was not one of those times. So it was here on move 49 that he ultimately resigned the game. Now, as this match is first to 7 wins, it's going to be much longer than the previous match against Nemesis. I don't know if I'm going to be showing every game, but I have at least taken the time to show you round 1. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see what comes next. Much more chess to look forward to, so I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.